This talk is about why biblical creation is good science. You sometimes hear in the media how biblical creation is supposedly anti-science or bad science, but I want to tell you that it's actually good science. In this talk, I'll give an introduction to the origins debate and tell you a little bit about my own background. Then I go through a whole list of reasons why biblical creation is good science, and then some conclusions. So first of all, an introduction. And I want to tell you about my own experience because I have a background as a lead designer of rockets and spacecraft, a very fun career, and I have first-hand experience of the immense challenges of engineering design. To give you an example of that, I designed the 14-meter solar array for the ENVISAT satellite. ENVISAT is the world's largest civilian satellite, cost about $2 billion. It's so big it would hardly fit in this hall. And from that work, I learned that design does not happen by chance. Just to illustrate this, here's a picture of the gearbox that I designed for the ENVISAT satellite. It has 3 of these gearboxes. This is what I call a double-action worm gear set. You don't have to understand it, but believe me, it is complicated. And I have a world patent on this gearbox. Just to tell you some of the challenges of design. Design requires intense creativity. I had to spend literally months sweating and working hard to invent this brand new gearbox, which is completely different to any other kind of gearbox. If someone said to me, well, all you had to do, Stuart, was just evolve this from another kind of gearbox, I would actually feel very offended because that was really hard to design. So design requires intense creativity, but it also requires intricate detail. That equation on the right-hand side of the screen, that is actually one equation. That is the mother of all efficiency equations. That took me months of sweat to develop that equation, but I had to do that to make sure that I designed the gearbox to exact requirements for the spacecraft. And that is hard to do. And so through my experience of spacecraft design, I absolutely discovered that design does not happen by chance, contrary to what you sometimes, the message you seem to get from evolutionists is that, well, the world could just appear by chance. And I believe that that message that design does not happen by chance is true not just of technology, but also of natural systems as well, what we see in creation. I also want to tell you that design is an emotional activity. This is something you don't learn at university or college, but it can be a very emotional activity. The ENVISAT satellite was launched on the 1st of March 2002 in French Guiana, and the most critical operation was the deployment of the solar array, which I designed. And it was actually the first ESA launch streamed live on the web. I remember halfway through the project to design ENVISAT, the manager of the whole program, he called me into his office and he said, Stuart, do you realize there's only one solar array on this satellite? And I said, yes. And he said, this satellite costs $2 billion. And do you realize that if, by the way, it's your solar array, do you realize if your solar array does not deploy within 50 minutes, then the whole mission is dead? And I said, I didn't know that. And he said, well, if you could remember that for the rest of the project, I would really appreciate that. And so I did. Then 2 weeks before launch, 2 weeks before the 1st of March, I began to feel physically sick, and I could not sleep. Again, it's one of those things they don't teach you at college and university, but it suddenly dawned on me that my solar array, if it did not work, the national press would be knocking on my door. So it was a very emotional activity. Now what I'm going to do is show you a video of the actual launch of ENVISAT to give you a little glimpse of the excitement of building something and sending a satellite into space. So with this IT system, I'm now going to, there we are, and if I'm clever with my mouse, oh, here we are. Okay, I'm going to play this video. There's a couple of things, a few things I'll mention first. First of all, you'll see the countdown. You'll hear the countdown in French. In Europe, the French insist the countdown sounds best when said in French. So you'll hear that. What I want you to notice is the emotion of the ground staff. Notice how they look nervous as ENVISAT goes up into space. Then look at the relief when ENVISAT is actually launched into orbit. This is a real video of the launch. Some of the footage is simulation, but it's based on real data. And I can tell you, I was in tears as I watched ENVISAT go up into space. I really did not know if it was going to work. So this is just going to be a couple of minutes, this video of ENVISAT being launched.
Reality.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, top. Allumage du Vulcain.
Within 3 minutes of liftoff, the giant boosters, performing their roles superbly, separate. Within the next minute, the fairing protecting the satellite from atmospheric friction is jettisoned. ENVISAT is now travelling at more than 10,000 kilometers per hour. Within 10 minutes of liftoff, the cryogenic main stage separation and the minutes that follow herald the most exciting moments of the launch vehicle's mission. 27 minutes from launch, and with separation from the upper stage a complete success, 1 hour into the launch, an ENVISAT solar array, the powerhouse of its operational capability, is deployed. And with
So here you can see the solar array being deployed. It's slightly speeded up. It happens much slower than that. But look at the reaction of the ground crew when everything is deployed.
that is released into near-perfect orbit.
Bravo, le satellite.
This is the most sophisticated, innovative laboratory ever put in space to study the Earth and to monitor the environment. But ENVISAT is not just for science. I would like to think of ENVISAT as our cornerstone for the Living Planet program of ESA, in which our intention is to serve the citizen.
There were a lot of tears at the end of that launch, I can tell you. It was a great relief. Now we're back onto here. Sometimes I hear evolutionists saying, evolution is very easy, the world can just evolve. But I often think, if only they tried to design an engineering system and saw the immense challenges of design, I'm sure they would not be so glib with their statements. By the way, one of the reasons ENVISAT is called ENVISAT is that it's an environmental satellite, but that's not actually the main reason it's called that. The main reason is that it is bigger than every American civilian satellite. And NASA were very envious, so we called it ENVISAT. I want to also tell you something about my scientific experience. I spent some years working at Cambridge University, and I was a fellow of Selwyn College. Being a fellow is very, very important because it meant that I was able to walk on the grass, on the greens. There are lots of greens at Cambridge. The students can't and the public can't, but I could walk on the greens. That meant I could literally walk in the footsteps of great scientists like Newton and Calvin, Maxwell and Fleming. And it was a great inspiration to be at the same university as those great scientists. Not only that, it was very inspiring to know that they were biblical creationists. They believed in the book of Genesis and in a creator. In fact, you could say Cambridge is a creationist university. Why do I say it's the top university in the world? It has the most graduate Nobel Prize winners in the whole world. I think at the moment is 61, more than any American university. Harvard has 48, I think, so 13 behind. It was a great experience being at Cambridge. Not only that, but I've also worked in the United States at a great university, Liberty University in Virginia. I was sponsored by the Royal Academy of Engineering to gain experience of working in the United States. And it was interesting working here, seeing the growing influence of the atheistic worldview, even in this great Christian country. But now I want to focus more on the origins debate. And it is so important to see that the debate is a battle of worldviews. Unfortunately, you don't hear this when you hear Dawkins and Nye, because they claim falsely that evolution is science and biblical creation is anti-science. And that is false. It is so important to realize that evolution is not science. It is a worldview. And biblical creation is not anti-science. It's just a different worldview. Unfortunately, the media often don't understand this, and they don't realize that evolution is a belief system. And so here's an example of an Australian website. Thankfully, not all Australians make this mistake. But in this Australian website, notice how it says, creationism versus science. This was a website about the Ham-Nye debate. And notice how it says, the scientist Bill Nye against the creationist Ken Ham. It's trying to give the impression that biblical creation is not science. And that is false, because the origins debate is a battle of world views. This is such an important point that I have these quotations here to show that evolution is an atheistic worldview. Here's a quote from Sir Ambrose Fleming, a very famous scientist from Cambridge University. If you studied physics at high school, you may well have learnt about Fleming's left-hand rule to do with electric motors and the flow of current. But Ambrose Fleming said this: evolution is essentially atheistic and an attempt to dispense with the very idea of God. You see, it's an atheistic worldview. Just one other quote about this from Professor Alan Linton, a very distinguished biologist in the United Kingdom. He said this: evolution is a man-made theory to explain the origin and continuation of life without reference to a creator. You see, it's not a scientific theory based on evidence. It's a man-made theory, an atheistic worldview. And there is an irony here, because creationists are so often accused of having a hidden agenda. Have you heard that in the press? Creationists have this hidden religious agenda. The truth is, it's the atheists that have a hidden rule out God agenda. And they're often very good at hiding that agenda. So it's ironic that they accuse Christians of that. So the origins debate is a battle of two world views. It's a biblical worldview, science including God, versus an atheistic worldview, science excluding God. It's not faith versus science. It's a biblical worldview versus an atheistic worldview. And the origins debate, it's a battle within science. There are biblical scientists, Newton, Maxwell, Calvin, Faraday, the great scientists, versus the evolutionary scientists, Darwin, Dawkins, Dennett, and Nye. I've decided to stand shoulder to shoulder with Newton, Maxwell, Kelvin, and Faraday. And if you believe in biblical creation, you stand shoulder to shoulder with the greatest scientists that have ever lived. If you believe in an evolutionary worldview, then you stand shoulder to shoulder with Darwin, Dawkins, Dennett, and Nye. So you have to decide which scientist you are siding with. It's not, shall I side with science? It is, which scientist do you want to side with? So that's just an introduction to the origins debate. Now I want to go through a whole list of reasons why biblical creation is good science. The first reason is that good science acknowledges when there is a worldview or belief system. That is so fundamental to good science. Biblical creation is good science because it fully acknowledges a belief system involving faith in the Bible. It's very difficult to hide that. If you believe in biblical creation, you can't hide that it's a biblical worldview. And scientists like Newton and Faraday, they fully acknowledge their faith in a creator. But evolution is poor science because it does not acknowledge that belief system involving faith in atheism. And if you look at Dawkins and Nye, they do not acknowledge their faith. If you saw the Ham-Nye debates, Bill Nye did not acknowledge his faith in evolution. Here is the claim that evolution is a fact. To Richard Dawkins, it is so important to him to portray evolution as a fact. So you have these quotes: evolution is a fact, beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt. You see how important it is to him that people see evolution as a fact. And then he says, no qualified scientist doubts that evolution is a fact. You see how important that is to Richard Dawkins. But the reality is different. Evolution is an atheistic belief system with assumptions. There is no proof or solid evidence for evolution, and many scientists reject evolution despite what Dawkins claims. Let's go through those 3 points. Firstly, evolution is an atheistic belief system with assumptions. Here's a famous quote from Sir Julian Huxley from 1942. He said this: modern science must rule out special creation. And there you have it, an assumption. What he should have said is modern science should be open-minded. But he didn't say that. He said modern science must be closed-minded. It must rule out special creation. And here's another quote from Dr. Scott Todd that explains a similar thing. He said this: even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Notice he didn't say modern science should be open to all the evidence. He didn't say that. He said we've got to ignore evidence for a creator. And so here you see proof that evolution is a worldview with its own assumptions or presuppositions. So here you can see so clearly evolution has a rule-out God agenda, and it is therefore a world view. But secondly, there is no proof or solid evidence for evolution. You may have heard of Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth. When this came out in 2009, there was great excitement amongst atheists, because if you look at the bottom of that book, it has this subtitle, The Evidence for Evolution. Now, Richard Dawkins, all his previous books had not a shred of evidence for evolution, so people were very excited when this book came out. At long last, we might have some evidence for evolution. If you open that book up, you open the book, and this is one of the things you read. We have no evidence about what the first step in making life was. When my youngest son read that, he said, "Daddy, there seems to be a contradiction between the subtitle of the book and the contents of the book. Shouldn't we be asking for our money back for this book?" If I was an atheist, I would feel very deflated at reading that, having read the subtitle of the book. So evolution is clearly not a scientific fact. It has no proof or solid evidence. And thirdly, many scientists reject the theory of evolution, including some of the greatest scientists that have ever lived. Dawkins says no qualified scientist rejects evolution. James Clerk Maxwell was an incredible scientist. He was the father of modern physics. And he said this: no theory of evolution can be formed to account for the similarity of molecules. He rejected evolution. And Lord Kelvin, the father of thermodynamics, another very famous, great scientist, he said this: scientific thought is compelled to accept the idea of creative power. He rejected the theory of evolution. And there are thousands of modern-day scientists who reject the theory of evolution. So you see, evolution is a worldview. It is a belief system. So biblical creation is good science. It acknowledges its worldview. But secondly, good science does not force one worldview on students or the public. And biblical creation is good science because Christian schools always present different worldviews. I've visited Christian schools around the world, and I've never been to a Christian school that forces just one worldview. They always present the evolutionary worldview for the students to consider. But evolution, in contrast, is bad science because evolutionists seek to teach evolution as the only worldview. To give you an example of this from the United Kingdom, there has been atheistic lobbying, very aggressive lobbying to have evolution taught to very young children. At present, evolution is taught from age 11 in the United Kingdom, but atheist lobby groups are trying to push that back to age 5. Creation scientists have tried to counter lobby. Just to give you one example of the news media, a national newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, they described this conflict and battle. Here we have a picture of Richard Dawkins, the pin-up boy for atheists. They described me as a pin-up boy for creationists. I've never been described as a pin-up boy before. I'm sure I'm better looking than Richard Dawkins. But there is this debate that's been going on in the UK. But I have some news, some sad news. We lost that battle. This September, in 2014, evolution is to be taught to 5 to 11-year-olds in the United Kingdom. And I've extracted this from the just released national curriculum. In state schools, the young children have to learn this. They have to identify how animals and plants are adapted to suit their environment in different ways, and that adaptation may lead to evolution. Note how adaptation is confused with evolution. Adaptation is not evolution or evidence for evolution. So these young children are going to be taught a very confused, false message from the age of 5. But another reason for explaining this to you is I wanted to explain the role of the British Humanist Association in this change. This was a very recent announcement on their website. The British Humanist Association said this: "We very much welcome the fact that evolution is to be taught in primary schools. This is a change we have long campaigned for example, through Teach Evolution, Not Creationism." Note how the British Humanist Association campaigned for the change. Many teachers and members of the public are unaware of the atheist roots of many of these changes in the teaching of origins in schools. And I don't know if that's the same in the United States, but it's certainly true in the UK. And many of the leading proponents of evolution are often atheists. In the UK, we have Richard Dawkins, Stephen Jones, Alice Roberts. They all have a special award from the British Humanist Association. They have this Distinguished Supporters of Humanism award. So you often find proponents of evolution are also hardline atheists. And I don't know if you find this here in the United States. Daniel Dennett, Eugene Scott, hardline atheists pushing evolution. And I think there's a message there. There is a connection between evolution and atheism. Evolution is an atheistic worldview. But thirdly, good science does not ban opposition. Biblical creation is good science because Christian schools always present the theory of evolution. But evolution is bad science because evolutionists seek to ban the teaching of biblical creation in schools. And again, I can give you some examples from the United Kingdom. Atheist groups have aggressively lobbied the United Kingdom government to ban biblical creation. Here's a quotation from Sir David Attenborough, who said the teaching of creationism should be banned in science lessons. Notice again this implied message that creationism is not science. It's something different to science. That's a falsehood. Just to make a note here, if Isaac Newton were here today, atheist lobby groups would ban him from going into science lessons because he would talk about his faith in a creator. But if you think this is a worrying trend, look at this quote. Dr. Alice Roberts, a professor of public engagement in science in the UK, has said this recently. New laws are needed to stop private Christian schools teaching creationism alongside evolution in science lessons. That's a bit worrying, isn't it? This could be coming across to the United States as well. You may as well ban Christian schools if you're going to ban the teaching of Genesis in a Christian school. If Isaac Newton was here today, the atheist lobby groups would want to ban him from Christian schools talking about his faith in a creator. I go back to Ambrose Fleming, that great creationist scientist at Cambridge University. He said this: "It is disastrous to the ethical development of the young to lead them to believe that men are descended from monkeys." And I agree with him. If you teach children that they've descended from animals, then surely they're going to be tempted to behave like animals. And if Sir Ambrose Fleming were here today, I'm sure he would be appalled at the pressure being applied by the atheist lobby groups on governments to teach evolution in schools. Then fourthly, good science does not intimidate opponents. That is not the method of true science. Biblical creation is good science because creationists are happy to debate and reason. That's always been my experience. But in the modern world, sadly, creation scientists are intimidated and bullied. And I can now give you some personal experience and anecdotes of that. First of all, scientists are intimidated if they sympathize with creationism. This is what Richard Dawkins has said. It's quite a famous quote. You may have heard of this before. Anyone who claims not to believe in evolution is either ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked. And there's a message there for scientists today. If you sympathize with biblical creation, you're going to be labeled as ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked. And that's not good science, to intimidate that way. Richard Dawkins also said, this is a quote I had earlier, "No qualified scientist doubts that evolution is a fact." What he's really saying there is, if you're a scientist who doubts evolution, he considers you as not qualified. So these are ways that scientists get intimidated. The consequence of these kind of quotes are that academics are fearful of expressing support for biblical creation. I know academics in my university who really would like to expose the weaknesses of evolution, but they are fearful of doing that. I know a very distinguished microbiologist in my university who told me, he said, "Stuart, I would like to create a unit exposing the weaknesses of the theory of evolution." But a few weeks later, he came back and he said, "Stuart, I cannot do it. If I did that, I would be demoted. I could be sacked. I cannot do that. I have to keep quiet." So academics are fearful of their position. And scientists are intimidated in other ways. This is something Stephen Jones has said, he's an academic and a columnist in the UK. He said this: creationists spread pure poison. That was the title of his article. Inside the article, he didn't have a shred of evidence of how creationists spread pure poison. But there's an irony here, because surely that title is spreading pure poison. So there is this irony. The very things that creationists are accused of, sometimes the very thing the atheist is guilty of. This is some recent news from the United Kingdom. 2 head teachers were demoted for allowing creationism to be taught in their schools. What happened was there was a United States-based creationist church came to the primary schools. If it comes to the United States, it's even worse. And so the head teachers allowed these creationists to come into the school, and they gave some literature out with some criticisms of the theory of evolution. And because those books were let into the school, the head teachers were demoted. So it's getting tough to be a teacher, to be a scientist. It's getting very tough. Teachers have said to me, what can we do? Especially with this new law coming up in September, the teaching of evolution in primary schools, teachers have asked me, what can they do? It's really hard. One of the things I've recommended to teachers is that they tell the children that some of the greatest scientists that ever lived rejected the theory of evolution. Scientists like James Clerk Maxwell and Lord Kelvin and Sir Ambrose Fleming, and that many scientists today reject the theory of evolution. And if anyone complains about that, just say you are quoting facts of history and facts about life today, and surely they cannot be demoted for quoting facts and history. Creationists are sometimes labeled as an insignificant minority. This is what Richard Dawkins has said about myself and Andy McIntosh. It's a great privilege to be lumped together with Andy McIntosh in this way. But Dawkins has said, my purpose is to convey the sheer magnitude of the error that Burgess and McIntosh are attributing to their hugely more numerous establishment colleagues who accept evolution. Actually, I dispute that, because my experience is many scientists do not fully accept the theory of evolution. But again, this is this labeling of creationists. Scientists are threatened if they sympathize with creationism. I've had many abusive emails from atheist organizations. I'm going to show you one now. This is from the Brights Atheist Organization. I don't know if you have these also in the United States. But I'll read you the email. Dear Stuart, I have heard that you welcome discussion with your students about design in nature. Well, that's quite difficult to avoid because I teach that subject, and I'm also co-editor of an international journal of design in nature, so it's quite difficult to avoid discussing it with my students. We would regard such a situation as being very serious and would seek to ensure you are called to account. And then he says, as always, we wish to be fair before proceeding to the next stage. One of the worrying things about these emails is they never really explained what the next stage was, whether it was abduction, assassination, or torture. So this was from John Wiltshire and the Brights Atheist Association. But creation scientists are targeted. And we also have these extreme anti-creation websites. I'm sure you've heard of the National Center for Science Education in the United States, a very extreme anti-creation website. And they inspired the creation of a similar website in Britain. This is one thing I wish the United States hadn't exported to Europe, because what has started in Britain is the British Center for Science Education, a group of atheists who pretend to be scientists. Actually, they don't even have a high school science qualification between them, but they claim to be scientists and write some really nasty things about creation scientists. Here's one quote about myself. Burgess is a hardcore fundamentalist and leading creationist in UK academia, the one that actually frightens the author of this article the most. I'm labelled as the most frightening person in the United Kingdom. It was very brave of you to have me over here for this conference. And he goes on to say, we plan on writing to heads of department at his university to tell them about his creationist beliefs. They did that. The first I heard was when a famous physicist, Sir Michael Berry, wrote to me and he said, Stuart, is it true that you think I work for the devil? And I said, have you heard from the British Centre for Science Education? He said, yes, that's where I got this information from. Then I explained they've hardly got a high school qualification in science between them. And he said, okay, thank you for explaining that. But it does lead to some quite embarrassing situations. And sometimes creationists are named and shamed in the national press. This is the front page of the Times Higher Educational Supplement, a national newspaper in the United Kingdom. Notice the headline, Intelligent Design Creeps Onto Courses. The implied message is that there's something bad going on. And underneath there was a quotation, evolution is disastrous because if you teach people that they are animals, then it is inevitable that they will behave like animals. I remember having a coffee when I was at my university. I was in the coffee room, and my professorial colleagues said, hey, Stuart, have you seen this quote about evolution is disastrous? And they read it out to me. And I said, that sounds a bit like Ambrose Fleming, but it sounds a good quote. And that's pretty, whoever said that, that was a very brave thing of them to say that. They'll probably lose their job. And I said to my colleagues, so who said that? And they said, well, Stuart, it was you. It's got your photograph and it's got your name. So then my colleague said to me, it's been nice knowing you, Stuart. It's been good to work with you. Actually, I didn't lose my job, but again, that was a bit of an awkward situation. Many scientists keep quiet about their doubts on evolution. This is the result of this intimidation. I know many scientists who would love to speak out, say something to the press, the weaknesses of evolution, but they are too fearful. Many scientists wait until retirement to express their doubts about evolution. Earlier, I quoted Alan Linton, that biologist in the UK. When he was retired, he said, evolution is a man-made theory. If you ask him, why did you wait until you retired to say that? He'll say, well, if I said it earlier, I would have had to have retired earlier. So I had to wait until that point. I know biologists who are refused posts because they say they believe in biblical creation. That's very unnatural selection. Intimidation is not the method of true science. And when you think about all that intimidation, isn't there a message in that? Doesn't that tell you there's something wrong with the theory of evolution? If proponents have to resort to that kind of intimidation and bullying, surely they're worried about something. Surely they're very defensive about something. But number 5, I want to explain that biblical creation best explains the origin of the universe. This is another reason why biblical creation is good science. Conservation laws support biblical creation. The first law of thermodynamics says that matter cannot be created or be destroyed. And there's a simple conclusion from that. Only a creator can explain the existence of a vast universe that we live in. And the Big Bang Theory contradicts that first law of thermodynamics, because the Big Bang Theory says there was nothing, and then nothing exploded, and there was something. Well, that contradicts that first law of thermodynamics. Conservation laws are so important. In my university, one of the first things we teach our engineering students is the first law of thermodynamics. It is so important for design and for engineering. I could not do my designs without the first law of thermodynamics. I've worked on the British Skylark sounding rocket, and when I worked on the design of that, I could not have designed it if I couldn't do a calculation of the change of fuel into energy, I had to use the first law of thermodynamics. At the moment, I'm working with Team GB to design racing bicycles for the Rio Olympics. I could not do that without using the first law of thermodynamics. And I'm working with Triumph Motorbikes to design better motorbikes. I couldn't do that without using the first law of thermodynamics. And in the origins debate, we cannot ignore that first law, and that first law supports biblical creation. There's an irony here that biblical creation is often called God of the gaps. Have you heard that? There's some gap in knowledge, and supposedly Christians fill that gap with God, so it's called God of the gaps. But actually, it's the Big Bang Theory, which is God of the gaps. A child says, "How did the universe come into being?" And the atheist says, "The Big Bang did it." It's the God of the gaps. Again, that irony, the very thing that creationists are accused of, it's true of the Big Bang. So now I want to explain that biblical creation best explains the origin of life, the very origin of life itself. Information laws support biblical creation. Self-replicating life requires vast information for that life to be replicated. I'm sure you've seen this kind of picture of a cell showing the amazing complexity of all the different parts of a cell. And a huge amount of information is required to specify the production of that cell. Information always comes from an intelligent source, and a creator is therefore needed to create life. The empirical evidence supports biblical creation. There have been searches that have taken place by evolutionists to find a simple organism, because for evolution to be possible, the first organism must have been very, very simple, perhaps with just a few units of information. And there should be evidence today of such simple organisms. And evolutionists have put in great effort to find such simple organisms. But do you know what has been found? This is the result of the search. The simplest organism has 580,000 base pairs of information. That's a lot more than 5 or 6. And that discovery has been devastating for the theory of evolution. That is empirical evidence directly against the theory of evolution. Secondly, laboratory experiments have failed to produce life in the lab. There have been millions of attempts to create life in the labs, to see if life can come out of some chemical soup. And again, that's devastating evidence against evolution. Ironically, biblical creationists are accused of not having empirical evidence. Well, this is great empirical evidence for biblical creation. Abiogenesis, this idea that life could come out of a chemical soup, it involves blind faith. This is what Richard Dawkins said. This is amplifying on an earlier quote. We have no evidence about what the first step in making life was, but we do know the kind of step it must have been. It must have been whatever it took to get natural selection started by some process as yet unknown. So just to interpret that, he hasn't got a clue how life started, how life could have come from a chemical soup. That is blind faith. If you want a definition of blind faith, that is blind faith. And there's this irony that biblical creationists are accused of blind faith. But the truth is, it is the opposite. The absurdity of abiogenesis. That's a very strong statement, so I won't say it myself. I'll let Lord Kelvin say it, one of the greatest scientists that ever lived. He said this: was there anything so absurd as to believe that a number of atoms, by falling together of their own accord, could make a microbe? And if Kelvin was here today, he would say, wow, life is so complicated. How absurd it is to think that life could just come together by itself. Biblical creation is sometimes called pseudoscience, But surely abiogenesis is pseudoscience. How can a teacher be demoted for questioning evolution when evolution cannot even explain how life could start? I once had a conversation with a non-Christian microbiologist at my university. He was a very senior microbiologist, a very senior scientist. And I said to him, what do you think of abiogenesis? As a non-Christian, what do you think of it? And he said, Stuart, it is black magic. It is utter rubbish. What Christians believe is far better. I wish he could say that to the media. If you go to the top and you speak to very qualified microbiologists, that is the thing that they will confess. Then number 7, biblical creation best explains the origin of kinds. This is another reason why biblical creation is good science. The laws of genetics support biblical creation because adaptation, things like color change or size change, it does not lead to evolution. It doesn't lead to new kinds of creature. Adaptation is simply shuffling of existing genes. Adaptation or speciation involves no new information. So if you look at Darwin's finches, yes, they adapt by having a change in size of beak or a more pointed beak or a sharp beak, but that is adaptation. That is not evolution. Biology books often quote this as an example of evolution, but it is not evolution. The peppered moth, the change in proportion of dark moths and light moths, that is not evolution. That is adaptation. Resistant bacteria, that is not evolution. That, again, is adaptation. I have 5 children. 2 of them have blue eyes, 3 of them have brown eyes. That doesn't mean they're beginning to evolve into different kinds of human beings. They may not be as frightening as me, but they're not changing into any other kind of creature. Adaptation is not evolution. I can give an illustration from engineering here. A range of cars is like adaptation. I work with Jaguar cars in the UK, and they have a wonderful range of cars, different sizes, different types, different colors. But that's just to suit different needs. Those cars are not evolving into another kind of technology like aeroplanes. They're still cars. So adaptation is not evolution. The laws of genetics with respect to gene mutations also supports biblical creation. Gene mutations produce only a loss of genetic information. And there are no examples of gene mutations creating novel structures. Gene mutations cause only deformities or neutral changes like the picture is showing here. Again, I can illustrate this from engineering. A spacecraft may have 100,000 components. A random change to a dimension never improves the design. A random change results in a loss of information. On the screen is one of my favorite components. In fact, I take this around with me, this worm gear. It's at the heart of that solar array, so it's very close to my heart, and I take this around with me. This one component has about 100 units of information that specify it. You can see lots of the dimensions there up on the screen. If you were to change randomly one dimension on that shaft, it would probably be catastrophic for the spacecraft. It would not improve the spacecraft. It would not begin to evolve it into another kind of spacecraft. It would be catastrophic. If you were just about to get on an aeroplane and the maintenance engineer came up to you and said, I would just like to tell you, just for fun, I've randomly changed one of the components on all the jet engines. I have not got a clue what effect it's going to have, but I just did it for fun. Would you still get on that aeroplane? Would Bill Nye get on that aeroplane? Would Richard Dawkins get on that aeroplane? What would their faith in evolution be like? Random changes don't improve designs. Then there is positive evidence for creation. I've worked for many years on the human knee joint, and I've written books and papers explaining how it is an irreducible knee joint. It cannot evolve step by step. It has a wonderful cam mechanism, the way the bones roll together. It also has a 4-bar linkage mechanism inside, the way it guides the bones. Every mechanical engineer knows that a 4-bar mechanism cannot evolve step by step. I've published this work in many secular journals. Just last year, I published this in the American Society for Mechanical Engineers, describing the intricacies of design of that knee joint. And that is evidence that we were created, we were not evolved. I've asked evolutionists to explain to me, how do you think the knee joint could evolve? One of the things they say to me is, you need a degree to understand the 4-bar mechanism. How can you expect me to explain how it could evolve? To which I say, well, if you don't understand the knee joint, how do you know that it could evolve? To which they sometimes say, I have faith that it could have evolved. I've also done work on peacock feathers and published this in journals like the Institute of Physics. Peacock feathers have an amazing beauty. They have bright optical colors, not colors due to pigment, but they have these precision thin film layers that give structural interference. The layers of keratin on a peacock feather are so thin, they are comparable to the wavelengths of colored light. And those thicknesses are so incredibly precise that you get different colors across the peacock feather. You get iridescent colors that change with the angle of view, and you get a digital pattern. The segments are so tiny, and there are loose barbs and tight barbs, many wonderful, beautiful features in the peacock feather. Those beautiful features require vast information in the genetic code, and there isn't even a selective advantage. So here again is very positive evidence for biblical creation. I've asked evolutionists to tell me, how do you think this could evolve? And they said, how can I explain how that could evolve? I need a degree in physics to understand the intricacies of a peacock feather. To which I say, well, if you don't even understand the peacock feather, how can you believe that it evolved by chance? Then number 8, another reason why biblical creation is good science. Biblical creation is good for science. It has a good effect on science. Here is a myth that we heard from Bill Nye in the Nye-Ham debate. Bill Nye said this: if creationism is taught to children in the United States, the country will fall behind. That was his claim. But that is a myth. The truth is the opposite. Biblical creation is good for science. Biblical creation inspired a revolution in science. The founding scientist, the greatest scientist that ever lived, scientists like Newton, Kepler, Pascal, Boyle, Euler, Bernoulli, Maxwell, Kelvin, they were inspired by the Bible. And many scientists today are inspired by biblical creation. Biblical creation also has a great advantage that it gives a scientist a high view of creation and an expectation of very good and excellent design. And to see where this can be an advantage, you can look at DNA. When scientists looked into the genome in the 1980s and 1990s, the term junk DNA was used to describe all non-coding DNA, which was 97% of the genome, because they didn't understand these sections of the genome. And the evolutionary scientists said, it must be junk. But instantly, creation scientists put their hand up and said, hang on, that will not be junk. If you have a high view of creation, if you believe in biblical creation, you have an expectation that it will be excellent design. And since 2000, biblical creationists have been proved 100% correct that junk DNA is not junk DNA. And if they had listened to biblical creationists earlier, they would have learnt that earlier. So biblical creation is good for science. Biblical creation encourages bio-inspired design. The Bible says God's way is perfect, and the Bible says that what God created was very good. And because of that, a biblical creation scientist will want to copy what God has designed. But if you read books by Richard Dawkins, where he says things like this, the human eye is not just bad design, it's the design of a complete idiot. That's what Richard Dawkins says. If you read his books, Richard Dawkins says the world is badly designed, humans badly designed. Everything is badly designed. Everything's black in creation for Richard Dawkins. If you read his books, you would never copy anything in the created world. And you would be held back because engineers who are good, they are keen to copy creation. I can give you a couple of personal examples. I have developed a bio-inspired micro air vehicle. It's a micro air vehicle that mimics the twisting and flapping of a dragonfly. And the micro air vehicle you can see in the screen. My team were very proud of building this vehicle. It has 1,000 components weighing less than 20 grams. And some of the components are so small, there are nuts on that air vehicle that are smaller than a pinhead. If you try putting on a nut onto a screw where the nut is smaller than the pinhead, it is very difficult. One of the things we weren't planning before we designed this vehicle, and I spent many weeks looking for a student with very small hands to put these things together. I was inspired by what God had designed. If I'd read a book on evolution, it would have told me that dragonflies were primitive creatures that evolved many millions of years ago. Don't bother copying that. But I ignored that, and I copied it, and I'm very grateful that I did copy that. Now, on this next slide, I'll see if I can... Yeah, you can see this. It's actually showing the flapping of the wings. Notice how the wings are twisting, not just flapping. And it's that twisting effect that produces the very strong lift.
Okay.
So that was just a picture showing a prototype that I produced. Just to give you one more example of bio-inspired design, I mentioned the knee joint earlier. My group has also produced a bio-inspired knee joint for robots and possibly prosthetics. In this bio-inspired joint, you can see we've mimicked the cam mechanism of the knee. We also have a 4-bar mechanism on the outside, both sides of the knee. And we've done tests and showed this is superior to many man-made joints with ball bearings and shafts. And we've published this in various journals. Again, I was inspired to do this because I have a high view of God's creation. It may be here. I can show you a video of the knee joint working. So here you're going to see the joint working there. You can see the 4-bar mechanism going forwards and backwards. So if any of you have a dodgy knee, you could see me afterwards. I can kit you out with one of these. Then, number 9, creationists produce good science. You often hear in the media, biblical creationists, they don't publish work, they don't publish good science, but I want to give you some examples where creationists produce good science. First of all, the MRI scanner, Dr. Raymond Damadian. I'm very thankful to him for producing an MRI scanner. On the bottom of that slide is a picture of my daughter's head. And that picture saved my daughter's life. And if I meet Raymond, I would like to thank him for that, because that enabled surgeons to do life-saving surgery on my daughter. So I very much hope to meet him one day. Secondly, this person is at this conference, Professor Andy McIntosh. He's the inventor of the pulse spray injector system, inspired from the Bombardier Beetle. And it's an amazing system and could have many applications for fuel injection and medical sprays. And he won a very senior award in the United Kingdom, the Times Higher Education Technology Award in 2010. Just to mention some of my own scientific publications, I'm an academic, so I don't mind showing off a bit. I have 130 scientific papers on design science, very relevant to the origins debate. Everything I have seen in the science of design supports biblical creation. I have more than 40 papers on design in biological systems, directly relevant for the origins debate. I'm a co-editor of the International Journal of Design in Nature, obviously very relevant to the origins debate. I have 7 patented machine devices, and I've won 5 national awards. Just to show you a couple of photos, there's a picture here of myself being presented by the Mollins Design Prize by the Right Honourable Peter Morrison MP, a senior government minister. And you can see I'm looking at a scroll in front of me. The reason I was looking at that, it's got a big check in it, and I was wondering how big it was. Just to show you one more picture, I received the Turner's Gold Medal from the Vice-Chancellor of City University for my work on spacecraft. But here's a counter question, because I've just explained that biblical creationists produce good science. Are atheist scientists qualified in the science of design? Because there are some particular atheists who claim to be experts in the science of design. Here's another quote from Richard Dawkins. Notice what he says: "A decent designer would never have perpetuated anything of the shambles, that is, the crisscrossing maze of arteries, veins, intestines, wads of fat, and muscle." He's referring there to the human body. He disputes the verse, "I am fearfully and wonderfully made." He says that verse is wrong. He says the human body is a shambles of design. Richard Dawkins is putting himself forward as an expert in design. He claims to be an expert. But many of the atheist scientists who claim to be qualified in design are just not qualified. Many of them, if they took my first year design course, would fail it, and by a big margin. They're not conscious of the things that they do not understand about design. They've not made anything or designed anything. And if they did, I'm not sure if I would trust it. And they are unaware of the challenges of design. Number 10. This is slightly different because I want to briefly explain why biblical creation is good theology. Just try to do it in one slide, because I would encourage you not to believe in theistic evolution, the idea that God would use evolution to create the world. That is very bad theology, not just bad science, but bad theology as well. The Bible teaches that death and suffering came through sin. Romans 5, verse 12. Death and suffering were not part of God's original creation. It wasn't part of his plan. But if you believe in theistic evolution, then you have to believe that God did nothing in creation. You don't see his goodness in creating the world. And you have to believe that death and suffering were necessary for life. In fact, if you read books on that promote theistic evolution, what you will read is that creation was a package deal that must include suffering. Dennis Alexander has said, God couldn't create a world without suffering. We have to accept this package deal. So theistic evolution is not just bad science, it's bad theology as well. So now briefly some conclusions. Origins is a battle of worldviews. It's the biblical creation worldview versus the evolutionary worldview. It's science including God versus science excluding God. And if you believe in biblical creation, you stand shoulder to shoulder with the greatest scientists that ever lived. Here is the danger of seeing evolution as science. Evolution assumes there is no God. Then, secondly, people think that evolution proves there is no God. And they can't see that, well, that was evolution's assumption in the first place. And that's very dangerous. And sadly, children as young as 5 in the United Kingdom will be told that evolution shows there is no God. This is an email I had after the Ham-Nye debate, because I appeared in that debate. I had many emails, but I wanted to share one with you. This was from a man called Richard, who was from the United States, and he said this: "For 2 years, I thought about the implications of evolution by natural selection, then realized that God almost certainly didn't exist, so I tore up my Bible. But I wrote back to Richard and I said, hang on, Richard, evolution assumes there is no God in the first place. It hasn't proven there is no God." And I hope that he can see that, and he sees the weaknesses in the theory of evolution. Why is biblical creation good science? Well, God's word explains my talk just in one sentence. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. That's what it boils down to. Just to put it another way, the fool has said in his heart, we must rule out God from science. That's what the fool has said. The fool has said, with evolution, all things are possible. That's their faith. But the truth is, all things are not possible with evolution. Only with God are all things possible. And this is why the creation ministry is so vital today. And Answers in Genesis do an outstanding job of showing that evolution is a worldview, of presenting excellent evidence for biblical creation. They deserve your full support. But I've got one more point to make. I've written a book called Hallmarks of Design, and the message of my book is, should science rule out God? And science should not rule out God. When I wrote my book, someone said to me, why don't you send a copy of this to Prince Charles, the future king of Great Britain? And I said, I could send it, but I'm not going to get a response. But I did send it to Prince Charles, and I had a letter back. And Prince Charles said this: "Thank you so much for sending me a copy of your book, Hallmarks of Design. I'm going to use a quote from my Wreath lectures in a few weeks' time. Thank you so much for sending me a copy of your book, Hallmarks of Design. I'm going to use a quote from this for my Wreath lectures in a few weeks' time." Those Wreath lectures were broadcast to 90 million people. And I was desperate to know what would be his quote. What's his quote going to be? How is he going to summarize the book, this future king of England? And this is what he said: "Why should modern science rule out special creation?" And when I heard that, I thought, there is a God. And I said to my friend and colleague, David DeWitt, I think Prince Charles was very brave to do that. David DeWitt said to me, actually, he's not that brave. He cannot be demoted or sacked. Thank you for your attention.